Hello, welcome to Idiot Wind, the blustering odyssey through the world of Bob Dylan and his definitive vinyl collection, a fantastic part work we're both enthralled by. And this week we're discussing John Wesley Harding, the wonderful album that we're both enthralled by. And how are you, Sid?
I feel like I know this album intimately, Sean.
Good. Good. It'd be good to finally get the chance to discuss it then.
Yes.
In our podcast.
Yes.
Idiot Wind.
I unlike some of our podcasts where some of our previous discussions where I'd never heard a note of the album before, I actually was familiar with a bit of this album because I bought it a few years ago in a slightly misguided attempt to at self-improvement.
That failed.
so I do know this one, but and funny enough, it's I think what's helping me with this edition is the wonderful magazine that we get with these great editions.
Yeah, well, what did you think of this issue? Issue number 8. What did you think about it?
Well, I'm glad you asked me, Sean. It's got a great picture in there that I don't think we've ever seen before.
No, in this package, I've seen it twice before in this same package here. I mean, the editors of this magazine, if there are any editors, which I doubt, can't get enough of that picture, can they? And, is it inside as well? Is it inside this? Yeah, we get it again on there. The front cover reproduced again. So it's 3 times in the magazine, and of course with the magazine you get the fabulous vinyl LP. So you get 4 copies of that picture with this week's edition. How remarkable!
Yeah, it is. It is a mystery to me that you know, in general terms, I mean, as you know, I'm not a massive Dylan fan, but I think these LPs so far, even where I've not been particularly, you know, enthralled by much of the music, they're great they're great sounding things, and so what I can't understand is why that, you know, they pay a bit of attention to it. These are good.
Yeah, I mean, again, this is a great pressing. They've all been great pressings.
But they don't pay any attention to putting in any kind of quality into this little flimsy magazine.
I mean, it's hardly like you can claim there aren't pictures of Bob Dylan. I mean, it's like he's an incredibly heavily photographed individual over the years, and there are loads of photos of him around the time of the recording of this record. You know, yeah. he was, and they appear in various forums and Bob Dylan archive releases, you know. So I am baffled by that. Why they can't find one other picture. They can't find a single other picture from this period to illustrate their magazine.
I guess it's just licensing and budgets. But so what's the background to this LP then? Where does it sit? And oh, actually, that's the other thing. Are we in proper chronological order with this one from the last one or not? I can't remember.
Well, wasn't the last one was Blonde on Blonde, wasn't it?
Yeah.
I think we are. I think we are in proper chronological order. You know, I should double check that in my magazines. Want to do that for you? We'd hate to get that wrong, wouldn't we? So have a look.
Yes, well,
yeah. Part 7 was Blonde on Blonde, which is the previous studio album.
Yeah.
So we are in chronological order. This is the next record in the chronology, which won't be the case with our next episode. And this is a very different record to Blonde on Blonde. Since he's recorded Blonde on Blonde, of course, he's been on a very famous world tour with the band, as they were later called, and he's been basically booed every night. People have called him Judas. So whatever is, and they are showing great bravado and, you know, public front about it. I think they were quite shaken up by that tour because this is a bloke who's selling loads of records, getting great reviews, And he's moved on to a new phase of his musical career. For the first time, he has electric musicians on stage on tour, and people are booing him every night. And I think also his health is in a bad way on that tour. I think he's taking a lot of amphetamine style stuff to keep him going. He collapses once or twice on the tour. And I think by the time he comes back to the US, after a great number of gigs in Britain, Europe, America, and Australia, I think, he's fed up. He's burnt out. He wants a rest. His manager immediately on arrival presents him with a list of 60 odd more gigs he's booked without telling him in the US later that year, which doesn't go down very well, to be honest. He says, no, I'm not doing them. And there's a quote in one of the books, somebody who works in Albert Grossman's office with great ire and self-righteousness. Doesn't he know how much work it takes to organize these concerts? And it's just, and I think this is not kind of taken into account the bloke who's going to have to go and be booed for another 60 odd times, and he's getting on his nerves, to be honest. And one of the things that happens after that tour is, yes, his motorcycle accident, or whatever the seriousness of that. I think there was an accident. I think he was injured, though nowhere near as seriously as he tried to pretend. But that was a useful way, of course, of getting out of the ensuing tour dates. And then him and the band start first casually recording on a daily basis, first of all at Dylan's house in Woodstock, then down the road at a building called Big Pink, where a couple of the band are living, and Garth Hudson particularly. And he starts recording there, and it is interesting, I think, that it is mainly, well, it is the musicians, it's exactly the musicians who are on that tour. Levon Helm pulled out of that tour at an early stage, and he isn't immediately at the what becomes the Basement Tapes recording sessions. They start recording without him, and other members of the band can play drums as well, you know. So, but he does later join them. He's soon part of it. But it is interesting, at the very start, it's the 4 or 5 people who've been at every one of those gigs. It's almost like it's rehabilitation. It's kind of, you know, it's getting back into making music in a more gentler, more enjoyable way. They want to have a laugh and they want to play music. They don't want to have people booing them. And a lot of that stuff it doesn't sound anything like the electric music played on the 66 tour. Dylan writes more than between 60 and 70 songs in those sessions, and they record them. And none of those records or tunes are then used when he decides to record John Wesley Harding after the bulk of the Basement Tape sessions. He writes 12 new songs, and he takes the train from Woodstock to Nashville, where the album's recorded, and that train journey takes 2 days, and he spends that time writing the first batch of lyrics, and then he puts them to music when he gets to the studio. Bob Johnston records the album again, and this time, unlike Blonde on Blonde, where you have 5 guitarists on one track, I think, it's just him basically playing harmonica, singing, the acoustic guitar and a bit of piano. And it's the great Kenny Buttery on drums and Charlie McCoy on bass for 10 of the 12 tracks, with Pete Drake joining on steel guitar for the final 2 tracks. So it's a very musically simple and clear album. It's very almost transparent. It's just them playing in the studio. There are no other songs written for this album. There are other versions in the outtakes of these songs, but as far as I'm aware, there's never been any other songs. He wrote 12 songs and they recorded them. This entire album is his most, up until this stage, at the very least, possibly ever, his most formally poetic album. He writes all the lyrics in the same structure. 3 verses and no choruses, and with one exception, no middle eights. There's one track that isn't 3 verses, and we'll come on to that, I'm sure, and that's the ballad of Frankie Lee and Judas Priest, which has considerably more than 3 verses. But that's the only one that doesn't, and only one other has a middle 8, and no choruses, really. Usually, the titles of the songs aren't mentioned more than once. So it's deliberate. He's deliberately taking the Bible as an inspiration, and the work of Hank Williams. It sounds austere. It sounds old. It sounds like it's a record from further back in the past, which is quite unusual at a time when he's previously been this kind of rebellious, radical, iconoclastic figure. And at the same time, in the same year, other artists are taking studio work to new heights of technical sophistication. He's not interested in that at all, and never has been. For him, it's just a record of a performance, always. And he always changes the songs when he plays them live anyway. So it is a very different album. It was released with no great pomp and circumstance. It's deliberately released quietly. He gives no interviews for this album. He's only interviewed once in 1967, and it's not to promote this record. It's another change. It's a change again. What did you think of it?
Well, I found it. I bought it many years ago, as I said at the start, and at the time, I think my impressions at the time were sort of generally favourable. But I've not listened to the album in a very long time, so getting this pressing, it's the first time I've owned it on vinyl.
It's a good pressing, isn't it?
Yeah, well, it sounds great. As I say, I've got the standard CD release, but no, it sounds great. But I have to say, I found the album. I've played it several times. I don't want to give you the impression I've just played it once. I have played it several times, and I have to say I've struggled greatly with this album. I was surprised by how dull I found it. I found it, whereas with some of the other Dylan albums, which I've not necessarily been mad keen on, I've found enough in them to kind of engage my interest. But there's something a little bit too monochromatic with this album for me, which I know is, as you very elegantly outlined, is perhaps deliberate and part of the appeal in some respects. It is austere, but there's something just very flat about the songwriting for me, and I struggled to really connect with any of it. On a personal point of view, however, what's interesting to me about Bob Dylan is there are two examples of it on this album. There's two songs which I heard as a young child growing up. I obviously All Along the Watchtower, the Jimi Hendrix cover is, that's the first version of that song I ever heard. I never heard the original version until many, many years later. And I'll talk a little bit more about the Jimi Hendrix song perhaps later on. And the other song that I knew of before I ever heard Bob Dylan's version of it was I Pity the Poor Immigrant, which was the B-side to Judy Collins's Amazing Grace.
Amazing Grace, yeah.
Which was, I think, out in 1970. And isn't there a third song which is covered by somebody else? I'll Be Your Baby Tonight. So I think I knew that song before, through somebody else, before I heard before hearing the original version. And that's the interesting thing. It often seems the case that people who cover Bob Dylan, they use the kind of quite Spartan framework of the song. If you think about All Along the Watchtower as performed on John Wesley Harding, it's very static musically. It's very one-dimensional. The lyrics are, just trotted out. The backing, you might almost describe it as perfunctory even. And it's what's interesting is the way people then take that basic framework and then inject this amazing, all this other stuff into it, like on the Hendrix version. I think the Hendrix version is like the definitive version of it. It's so exciting. And there's a line on on the Hendrix album, on the Hendrix track, where he two riders approaching and the wind begins to howl. And as a kid, I found that incredibly cinematic and impressive, and yet here on the album, you know, it's just like, you know, it's sort of barely remarked upon. You know, it doesn't seem like a pivotal moment in the. Hendrix uses that moment as a launch pad into this stratospheric soloing that he does.
Yeah.
And on the album, it's just kind of more kind of and chunga chung. So it's full of those amazing moments where I think, blimey, you know, and on the one hand, I think, you know, that's, you know, great that he sticks to his guns and he performs these things, but my overall impression of the song is, it's just of the album, it's just a bit too samey. However, let's have a bit of variety, Bob. Let's have a little bit of colour in here somewhere, surely. So there we are.
Yeah, I think it's true that the Jimi Hendrix version of All Along the Watchtower is transformational, and Dylan himself was enormously impressed with Jimi Hendrix's version, and
I bet Dylan was also enormously impressed with the royalties that accrued from the Jimi Hendrix.
He would have been enormously impressed, yeah. But you know, he did adopt many of the elements of that arrangement for his own live arrangements in future years of All Along the Watchtower, which are far more rocking than the version on this album. But it does kind of go along with the approach to the album and his attitude to these songs when he's recording it, which is words first. He is delivering the words, and he swings about in his public statements. Of course, it's about the music. Or, of course, it's about the words, but there is a suspicion with Dylan that often the words are more important. I mean, he would deny that on occasion, and other times he'd agree with it, you know. But I think Lenoir has said some things about that. He was very interested in the words more than anything else when they were recording together, you know, particularly on the album Time Out of Mind. I think on this record in particular, this is his most, there's a few challenges to it, but I think this is his most self-consciously poetic album, I think, in terms of the words. And because of that, and because of the simple backing, I think there's a case to be made that he is more bothered about the words on this record. That's not true of all the records. You know, that's definitely not true of some records after this, immediately after this. But and I take your point about the monochrome. That's a good word to describe this album in many ways. I mean, you're using it pejoratively, which is absolutely fair enough. But I think you can use that as descriptive, positive as well. He is trying to make a monochrome album, but it's got a monochrome picture on the cover, and it is a very muted tones of that album cover, and they suit this album. The cover suits the album in a kind of weird way. It's a very odd cover indeed, that photo with the Indian musicians who are visiting Albert Grossman's house. He just had his picture taken with them and smiling away there, totally irrelevant to the record. they're just there for atmosphere, aren't they, on that kit, that's something. When you look at that picture, that's a very eccentric picture. It's more eccentric than almost anything else on this record, which is very somber in terms of, there is humor on it, but not much. And it's only in the last two tracks, when Pete Drake arrives with his steel guitar, where Dylan deliberately lightens the mood with Down Along the Cove, which is basically a song about going for picnics and walk down the beach with his wife and kids. That's what that's about. And then I'll Be Your Baby Tonight, which is another good song, but completely out of a different mood range to the rest of the album, those two tracks. That last track is the only track with a bit late. It's like this has been the thing, now I'm releasing this from that. And what another funny thing is, this last year or so, with his film The Shadow Kingdom and his tour on his promoting his album Rough and Rowdy Ways, which forms a great deal of that set list on that tour. He is doing that track, and he's doing it in which is a lovely sensual song, country style on this record, but he's deliberately emphasizing his age on this record, on this, not on this record, on this latest versions of it in the last couple of years. So it does sound deliberately sinister. Like this very old man is saying, "I'll be your baby," and when he does it in Shadow Kingdom in particular, it does sound a bit. It's almost humorous the way he does it. You know what I mean? It's like I'm now 80 and I'm singing this song, and it's like he's very self-consciously singing it. Yeah.
Is it very bad that you've now put an image in my head of an 80-year-old Bob Dylan wearing a nappy saying, "I'll be your baby tonight"?
Well, if that's the image you've got in your head, Sid, there you go. Yeah, very, very good. But it's in Shadow Kingdom. I think that's the song. I might be wrong. I think it's that song he sings with a woman either side of him, a glamorous woman either side of him, and they're just like looking into the camera in monochrome again, and he's singing this song right into the camera. And at one point, they're just like this, these two women either side, just looking into the camera as well. And at one point, one of them looks down at his shoulder and just wipes his shoulder like he's got dandruff or dust on his shoulder, and then just turns back to the camera, just to emphasize how old he is. And I thought that was really funny. And genuinely, deliberately funny, She just looks down and just wipes this off his shoulder. And anyway, I can't listen to that song now, even though it's a very nice song, without hearing the new rendition, which is a bit different. Yeah. Anyway, I think this is one of his most important albums, but I fully understand your views on it. Yeah. Because I think there's a lot of very important songs and very important lyrics on this album. Last night I was out with a friend of mine who is a dyed-in-the-wool Bob Dylan fan. He's got every album. He's trying to buy them on vinyl as well from various second-hand sellers. He's got books lined up about it, and he was. I was telling him we were going to do this.
Stop right there. Tell him I've got 14 he can have.
Yeah. And I was telling him we're doing this today, this morning. Well, where are you up to? He said, John Wesley Harding. And he said, I've always had problems with that record. Right. He said that straight away. So it's not just you. So even though previously before this evening last night, I would have said, it's just you, Sid. This is a masterpiece. It's not the case. Even among heavy Bob fans, there are people who have the problems my friend has with it, and there are people who say it's the best album he ever made. Right. And it's just that range of opinion with someone like this, isn't it?
I found, as I say, listening to it again, I wanted to try. I did want to like it, especially coming off the back of. The albums that we'd had, the run of albums we'd had beforehand, like Blonde on Blonde and the other.
Always 61, Bringing It All Back Home.
Bringing It All Back Home.
Great stuff on those records.
Generally, I really did enjoy them, and there's various ups and downs on them for me. And actually, in some respects, there's a lot to like on this album as far as I'm concerned, because the songs are relatively short. And as you say, often they only have 3 verses, and that seems to me, as somebody who doesn't like it when Dylan goes on and on, I often feel with Bob Dylan, if he just stopped there, I would have been all right. But the fact that he's going on for another 5 minutes is just, it makes me want to pull my own head off. Speaking of which, so there's a track on here, I can't remember what it's called, the Ballad of Frankie Lee and Judas Priest. I did want to book a flight to Dignitas when I was listening to that the other day. It was just unremittingly so I struggle. I do struggle a lot with this sort of stuff, but I kind of really struggle to see what is good in it. It's my feeling. It's definitely not
yes,
feeling. I accept I'm to blame for this, and I must do.
Oddly enough, that is the song, the one you've just denigrated there with some venom, is the song that gave the band Judas Priest their name. They took it from that song.
Well, there we are. So that's very much the silver lining on the cloud, I think. What's the? I hesitate to ask this question as we near the end. What's the one track on this album? If you were forced to pick one track, what would the one track be, and why?
I Dreamed I Saw St. Augustine is my favourite track on this record. I think All Along the Watchtower is brilliant. I think several of the songs are brilliant. I think The Wicked Messenger is brilliant. I think I Pity the Poor Immigrant is brilliant. I love As I Went Out One Morning, which I think is a fascinating lyric. But I Dreamed I Saw St. Augustine is, I think it's a lovely tune. And I think the words are fascinating. There are two St. Augustines, and neither of them is mentioned in this song. It's not about St. Augustine, really. The St. Augustine in this song is put out to death. That didn't happen to either of the actual St. Augustines. This is a St. Augustine who comes to the poorest parts of town where people are in the deepest misery and lectures them about their failings and where they're going wrong, while wearing a coat of solid gold. And therefore has got quite a bit of money behind him, and he's lecturing the poor. And surprisingly, that doesn't go down very well, and he is put out to death. And one of the people who's put him out to death, probably a jury member, is the narrator of this song. And I think this is one of several songs on the record where Dylan is looking back at the version of him that toured in '66 and before. He's looking back on his old self with some degree of criticism. In The Wicked Messenger, the guy comes to town, says no mysterious things, and is basically met with a bunch of unimpressed people who say, piss off, you know. And I always remember the line in that song. He was behind the assembly hall. It was there he made his bed. And in 2013, I saw Dylan in Blackpool, and he was apparently booked into a posh hotel in that area, but he never left the tour bus in the car park of the venue for the 2 or 3 days he was in Blackpool. And I remember, I always think of that when I think of behind the assembly hall. It was there he made his bed. This is about Bob Dylan coming to town and being met with justified skepticism by everybody he talks to. And everything he says in that song is completely meaningless as well. There was a wicked messenger. He calls himself the Wicked Messenger. And it is a very interesting record. I think there's a lot of autobiography hidden behind all the King James Bible and Hank Williams inspiration on this record. But as I Dreamed I Saw St. Augustine, I think he's looking back at the image of himself he sees from the previous era, and he's putting that version out to death in that song.
Okay.
What's your favourite?
Well, I would struggle, to be honest. I guess it could be All Along the Watchtower, because it's relatively innocuous, but then it would always make me, and it always, you know, I'd be.
That's one of the most brilliant lyrics in the history of rock music. On that track.
It would make me think of the better version. So
yeah, there's also XTC's version on their album White Music. That's a great version as well. Very different to Jimi Hendrix's or Bob's, it has to be said.
Fair enough. So I'll probably I'd dally with what's the track where he plays the piano? Hey, Mr. Landlord or something.
Dear Landlord.
Dear Landlord. Oh yeah, side 2. First track, side 2. I quite like that, just if only because it sonically it's just different. You know, it has piano on it, and it sort of has a different chord. I think sometimes when you're playing the piano, it forces you to musically go in different directions than if you're just endlessly strumming, remorselessly strumming a guitar. So I'd be stuck between All Along the Watchtower and Dear Landlord. If I had to pick right here, right now, I'm going to go for Dear Landlord. Okay, so what's the next album that we're dealing with in this series, in this fantastic series?
The next album is, in fact, I was wrong before, it is the next album chronologically. And that's a very different record, a much lighter record, perhaps more fun for the casual listener. That's Nashville Skyline.
Right.